Video games have always been a hobby, and something that my friends and I would always play when we hung out as kids back in the day. I've got awesome memories of playing popular games like Pokemon, Dragon Ball Z Budokai, Smash Bros, you name it, with my friends. But right around high school, life took me on a different path than my childhood friends. I became busier with things like school and sports, and I fell out of touch with my buddies, as well as for a short period of time, myself. As I went off to college, and as I started on a new path, I found myself reconnecting more with my friends. We got back to hanging out and playing games together just like we used to, and then one day in 2018, one of my friends offered to let me borrow his copy of The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. The only Zelda game I had played before was Spirit Tracks back in like 2010 or 2011, and I thought it was alright, but nothing really that special. I heard that Breath of the Wild was fun, but I didn't have any crazy expectations since I wasn't really that into the Legend of Zelda series. As I started playing the game, I quickly realized it was unique, like nothing I had ever seen before, and when I finally beat it, I wanted another taste of the Legend of Zelda series. The world, the characters, the adventure and the story, all of it was amazing. I just needed to get my hands on more. I was addicted. Over the last 5 years, I went on my own adventure and played every game in the Legend of Zelda timeline. From Zelda 1 all the way to Breath of the Wild, I adventured through Hyrule and other spectacular lands as Link, and so I wanted to take this time to share my own personal experiences and perspectives from each Zelda game that I played. So come with me as we look through the last 5 years of David Tork's life and observe the surprisingly impactful ways that the Legend of Zelda series has affected my friendships, relationships, and life in general. My story begins many years back, sometime around 2010. The Legend of Zelda Spirit Tracks had just been released, and my buddies convinced me to try it out. I remember playing through and enjoying the game. Using the touchscreen and stylus to control Link and all his actions was fun, and I love the mechanic of using the Nintendo DS microphone to use the Spirit Flute. I used to try to make my own songs on the flute despite my clear lack of musical talent. I also liked customizing the Spirit Train and traveling to and from different areas on the map. Traveling on the Spirit Train made the world seem so big, and being chased by the Dark Trains was a pure adrenaline rush, almost reminiscent of being chased by Guardians in Breath of the Wild. What I really loved about this game though was that it had multiplayer. I remember hanging out in basement forts with my friends, competing with each other to see who could get the most Force Gems as if our preteen manhood was on the line. There really wasn't much content in the multiplayer portion of this game. Honestly, it wasn't even really that good. Despite that, the fact that I was able to enjoy it with my friends was really what stuck out to me, and it's one of the first things that I think about when I think about Spirit Tracks. Like I mentioned, this was my first and only Zelda game that I played when I was a kid, other than maybe a couple minutes worth of Twilight Princess one time. So, I really didn't know anything about the Zelda series. Spirit Tracks didn't really help me too much with that either. It's actually a very contained and independent story that without context really isn't related to any of the other games. I enjoyed playing it, but I didn't really feel that attracted to play any of the other games in the series. Years went by, and like I alluded to, my priorities shifted, and I spent much less time playing video games, other than an occasional round of Smash Bros. Fast forward to 2017, I eventually started going to a college in a different city, about an hour and a half away from home. I played sports real seriously throughout high school, and I had the opportunity to play in college but actually turned that down. I really wanted to focus on school and other priorities like my friends and girlfriend. Now that I had a lot more time on my hands, I was able to reconnect with my old friends I hadn't seen in a long time. We all began hanging out a lot more. We'd play Smash 4 on Wii U, watch the newest episodes of Dragon Ball Super, and do plenty of other nerdy stuff like we did when we were kids. One night in spring of 2018, I was back in town from school for spring break. My friend Brodavia asked me if I had heard of the new Zelda game on Nintendo Switch, Breath of the Wild. At the time, I'd only played Spirit Tracks, so I told him I hadn't. He pulled out the game and showed it to me. I thought it looked fun, and he offered to let me borrow his copy on Wii U. I accepted, and when I got back to school, I immediately put my game in my Wii U and started playing it. Lights off, sitting right in front of my monitor, Wii U gamepad in hand, I woke up in the Shrine of Resurrection. And the moment I got out, I was greeted with a massive landscape, just begging to be explored. As I took it all in, I began to realize that this game was going to be grander than I ever imagined. I ended up playing the game until like 3 a.m. the next morning. Exploring the Great Plateau was so fun, and getting the paraglider and flying off the Great Plateau was even better. All of a sudden, I had unlimited freedom to explore and do whatever I wanted. Instead though, I followed the markers on my map. Why? Well, I had never played an open world game before, and I thought I should just go where I was told to. Thankfully, I quickly got distracted and ended up exploring just about everything I could before I got to the first point on my map. See, that's one of the beautiful things about Breath of the Wild, the distractions. Sure, you can follow the path the game sends you on, but there's so much in between point A and point B that it's impossible to not get distracted. There's so many distractions, and the game has given you the freedom to actually act on those distractions. In many games, you'd see a giant cliff and think, oh, that's a mountain, I must need to find a way around it. But in this game, if you see a mountain, you climb it. If you see a cliff, you paraglide off of it. Nothing is off limits in this game, provided you have enough stamina. And that's another great thing. You're incentivized to explore because of the Sheikah shrines. Every time you find one, you get a new fast travel point, and every time you beat one, you're one step closer to another heart container or stamina wheel, which helps you explore even more. The game does a perfect job tricking you into progressing slowly, making the experience even more enjoyable and unforgettable. I can't tell you how many times I've told myself, okay, I'll play for an hour, do some homework, and go to bed. But I ended up playing for 3 or 4 hours before I realized I still had homework to do. Don't worry though, I was a good student and always got my work done. Seriously though, this game completely sucked me in. There was one morning that I woke up at like 5 a.m. just so that I could play it a few hours before I went to physics class. After class, I actually ended up going back to my dorm and played it for another several hours until it was time for my next class. Seriously, I promise I'm a good student. I just loved this game. Breath of the Wild is by far my favorite Zelda game. Heck, Breath of the Wild is my favorite game in general, other than maybe The Legacy of Goku 2. After playing hours and hours and hours of the game, playing through the story and the DLC multiple times, I have yet to get bored of it. The openness and freedom that the game provides is incredible and unlike anything I've ever experienced. And honestly, despite what some people think, the story is great. Breath of the Wild redefines the Zelda series, and it sets future games in the series up for extreme success. It ignores so many of the mechanics that are found in traditional Zelda games, but doing that allowed for the developers to introduce and test out tons of new ideas. New ideas that I absolutely loved. From climbing mountaintops to cooking monster cakes, I was obsessed with this game and I didn't want to put it down. Unfortunately though, all good things must come to an end, and a few months later, I had to return the game to Brodavia. At this point, I considered myself a fan of The Legend of Zelda, but having just returned Breath of the Wild to Brodavia, I couldn't play it anymore. I really wanted to continue my adventure as Link, and so I decided I was going to try out other Zelda games in the series. I had heard the other games in the series were really good, and that Ocarina of Time was considered to be the best, so right around June of 2018, I turned on my 3DS and was greeted to one of the most atmospheric title screens of all time. Wow. When I look back on Ocarina of Time, this is always the first thing that comes to mind. If you've played Ocarina of Time, you know the mystical and adventurous tone that this game has, and this title screen perfectly encapsulates this tone. I know for many people, Ocarina of Time is considered to be the greatest game of all time. The story is absolutely incredible, and the gameplay is crisp and polished. Ocarina of Time was the first 3D Zelda game ever made, and it served as a building block for every other 3D Zelda game to come. Z-targeting was created in this game, and it's been present in every other 3D Zelda game since. Many other games took mechanics established in Ocarina of Time and used them to improve their games too. In a sense, Ocarina of Time was the foundation for 3D games in general. Pivoting back to my experience with the game though, since I played the 3DS version, the game left me with a different impression maybe than those who got to experience it the first time on the Nintendo 64. That said, I absolutely loved it. Personally, I think Ocarina of Time 3D is the best iteration of this game. The updated graphics and character models allow the game to be so much more expressive, and it really adds to the emotion of the story. The way the 3DS uses the touchscreen for both the map and equipping items is absolutely brilliant, and it helps streamline what were previously tedious aspects of the game. Overall, the 3DS version of the game improves on what was already an amazing game. Like I said, the story is incredible. As someone who liked Breath of the Wild story, I was absolutely astounded by the story of Ocarina of Time. From the moment you wake up in Kokiri Forest, you're completely immersed. In the same way that you aren't able to put a good book down, I really couldn't put this game down. As I kept on playing it, I kept meeting new, unique characters, and the game kept introducing awesome plot points. The dungeons are also original, and the ability to travel in time and play as both adult and child Link simultaneously was so cool. Especially because there were some dungeons, like the dungeon in Gerudo Desert, that you couldn't beat unless you went back in time and completed a specific portion of it as child Link. Since I mentioned the time traveling puzzles, I just wanted to say that the puzzles in general in this game are great. They're challenging but solvable. There were a few times in the game where I was really stumped and didn't know what the next steps that I needed to take were. I had to think hard about all the items that I had acquired up to those points, and how I might be able to use those items to solve each puzzle. At the time, I was in the middle of studying engineering, and puzzles like these were awesome opportunities to practice problem-solving skills I was learning in school. The game seriously helped me train my brain to think in specific ways. It was a great study break for me because it helped keep my mind fresh in between long homework or study sessions. Another great aspect of the puzzles in this game are that they're rewarding. As you find out later in this video, there are some games in the series that I don't think use puzzles and problem solving to their advantage. Rather, the puzzles and problem solving aspects actually took away from the enjoyment of the game. This game, however, does a perfect job blending puzzles in with the story. More often than not, solving a puzzle in this game results in progression, and that progression rewards you with new items, scenery, and story. I still remember trying to get through the water temple and being on the verge of giving in and looking at a how-to guide because I was so confused. I thought that I had exhausted all of my options, used all of my items, and explored the entirety of the dungeon. I thought I had done everything I could possibly do to get through this dungeon. I thought I was stumped, and I remember closing my 3DS, going to my computer, typing in Ocarina of Time Water Temple walkthrough, and right before I clicked the link, an idea popped in my head. I reopened my 3DS, walked into a specific room of the temple, and took off my iron boots. As I floated up, I realized there was a secret level in the room that wasn't visible from the bottom. I can't tell you how excited I was to figure that out. I was on the verge of giving up, and I actually managed to solve the puzzle at the very last second. I was so satisfied. And what was even better was that because I had solved the problem, I was able to progress through the dungeon, and I was rewarded with one of the coolest fights in the game against Dark Link. Ocarina of Time is truly a special game. Regardless of whether you played it when it originally came out on Nintendo 64, or if you played it many years later on Nintendo 3DS like me, I'm 100% sure you had an absolute blast, and that it cemented itself as one of the best games you've ever played. Because of the amazing world, rewarding puzzles, and intricate story, Ocarina of Time stands the test of time and remains one of, if not the best Zelda games of all time. From the very beginning of the game, all the way through to the end, it delivered and kept me invested. So invested, in fact, that in September of 2018, when I finally beat Ganon and saved both the past and future Hyrules, I was immediately ready to start my next adventure in the Legend of Zelda series, The Legend of Zelda: The Wind Waker. To say that The Wind Waker is a very different game than Ocarina of Time is certainly not an understatement. From a visual standpoint, the differences are obvious. While Ocarina of Time had a much more realistic style, Wind Waker flipped the script and decided to go with a more bright, cartoony type of style. This isn't a bad thing though. In my opinion, Wind Waker complements Ocarina of Time better because of all of its differences. At its core, it's a Zelda game, just like Ocarina of Time, but it offers its own unique twist to the Zelda formula. From a gameplay perspective, it's super fun. It definitely takes the 3D Zelda gameplay that was established in Ocarina of Time and improves on it. The scale of the game feels so much larger, and the majority of the world, towns, dungeons, and other areas have a much more grandiose feel. It's about as close to an open world game as Zelda had gotten prior to Breath of the Wild, since it's set on a vast sea. You have near complete freedom to explore the sea and all the different islands from the moment you get the sail, and there's so much scattered throughout the sea that make the exploration worth it. Whether new islands, enemy bases, a ghost ship, or even a tower owned and operated by a 35-year-old man who thinks he's a fairy, this game rewards you for exploring and finding new areas. The game's story also encourages and rewards exploration, since Link has to sail to new islands to progress in the story. While sailing across the map to progress through the story, you can easily get distracted and caught up exploring other islands you find along the way. Speaking of the story, it's excellent, and it definitely does a good job tying in other games like Ocarina of Time. Ganondorf's motivation and characterization in this game is so cool. The game does an awesome job showing his human side, and it's interesting to think about what kind of a character he could have been if things had gone a bit differently in the past. I also really liked Link's motivation from the very beginning of the story. As someone who has younger sisters, I can totally relate to the whole big brother wanting to protect his younger sister motivation that served as the catalyst for the entire story. What's really cool about Link though is that at the beginning of the story, he's just some average kid living on a supposedly random island, and throughout the adventure we get to see him grow and transform into the legendary and courageous hero that we knew he could be. Tetra's also really cool. In the beginning of the game, there's an aura of mystery about her, and you really want to learn more about her and her pirate crew, as well as the motivation behind her actions. As you progress through the story, you come across certain things that help peel back the curtain and give light to the mystery behind her character. In Ocarina of Time, Sheik served as an alter ego or secret identity for Zelda, and it was really cool when Sheik was finally revealed to be Zelda. Similarly, in the Windwaker, Tetra's revealed to be a reincarnation of Zelda. The unique aspect of this reveal, though, is that Tetra had no idea. As it turns out, we're now put in a classic Zelda position where Link and Zelda are up against Ganondorf. All the puzzle pieces have come together, and we realize that we're once again trying to stop Ganondorf, just like we did in Ocarina of Time. Wow. At this point, I was fully invested in the story. The story was already so great because of the unique way it differed from the more serious Ocarina of Time. But now, as everything came full circle, I found myself even more invested in what was going to happen next. I really enjoyed the Wind Waker, and I breezed through the game faster than any of the other Zelda games I'd played thus far. At that point, I was on a Zelda high, and whenever I wasn't studying, working, spending time with my girlfriend, or hanging out with other friends, I was playing Zelda. The fact that the Wind Waker is almost like a direct continuation of Ocarina of Time's adult timeline ending really piqued my interest. See, that's what I love about the series. The way the Zelda team took a jumbled up bunch of games and connected them all using Ocarina of Time as a three-way timeline split is truly brilliant, and we fans now have so much more motivation to play the older games because they directly relate and influence the story as we know it. This is one of the reasons I decided to play all the games in the series. I wanted to know how everything was connected, and I wanted to be able to make connections as I play future games in the series, like Tears of the Kingdom. So, when I finished beating the Wind Waker in October of 2018, I immediately started playing another Zelda game, that being The Legend of Zelda: Twilight Princess. So Twilight Princess originally released for both the Wii and the GameCube in 2006, and I still remember hearing my friends talk about how cool Link was in this game, his wolf transformation, and the eeriness of the twilight. Since I was in elementary or middle school and didn't know anything about The Legend of Zelda, when I heard them talk about the twilight and the princess and the wolves, I think I might have gotten the wrong idea about this game and associated it with the Twilight book series. There was no way I was going to let my good name be associated with that. I didn't want people to think I was Team Edward or Team Jacob, so I never gave Twilight Princess a chance. Thankfully, over the years, the Twilight book series seems to have lost its relevancy, and I was really into The Legend of Zelda at this point. My friends knew I was wanting to play through all the games in the series, and so my friend Connor lent me his copy of Twilight Princess HD. After playing this game, I can confidently say that I'm Team Link, and that all my preconceived notions about this game back in middle school were wrong. When I played Twilight Princess, I was amazed by the radical shift in tone from the Wind Waker. Both games at heart are traditional 3D Zelda games, but when you look at the surface, they're completely different. Where Wind Waker's cartoony and cheerful, touting bright, cel-shaded graphics, Twilight Princess flips the script and conveys a darker, more ominous tone with more realistic graphics. Well, somewhat more realistic. Wind Waker's set on a vast sea that you have to sail through to get from one place to another, but Twilight Princess returns to Hyrule, where you explore Hyrule Field and get to different areas like Death Mountain, Zora's Domain, and Kakariko Village. Wind Waker was a really fun and exciting adventure that I think did an amazing job testing new mechanics within the series, and honestly I think the very same of Twilight Princess. What I've observed though is that most fans prefer Twilight Princess over the Wind Waker. I think this is because Twilight Princess is more of a return to form for the Zelda series. Wind Waker really felt like a step in a new direction, and people are often hesitant to changes. Even though Wind Waker is really aged like a fine wine, Twilight Princess has always had a solid reputation, and I think that's what people like about it. Personally, I think, to each their own. I'm not going to judge someone for liking one game over another. I think I like Wind Waker more than Twilight Princess, but that doesn't mean I don't like Twilight Princess. I think it's an amazing game, and I had an absolute blast playing it. I really enjoyed the atmosphere of the game. The story was amazing. If you look at the timeline, Twilight Princess is set in the child branch of the timeline after Majora's Mask. We don't actually know too much about what happens to the hero of time after Majora's Mask, and this game actually offers a little bit of insight with that on the hero's shade, the unsettled spirit of Link from Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask. What's crazy though is that this isn't even a major plot point of the game. It's just an additional expanded bit of lore that I think every fan of the series wanted to know about. The game perfectly integrates new lore and concepts with pre-existing themes and history that we knew from the Ocarina of Time game. I mean, just like in the Wind Waker, the same Ganondorf from Ocarina of Time is the main antagonist of this game. Link is also a direct blood relative to the hero of time, and a lot of the areas you get to explore in Twilight Princess have direct or indirect relationships with the areas you explored in Ocarina of Time. The callbacks to previous themes from other games in the series is absolutely amazing. But what's even better is that Twilight Princess manages to tell its own completely unique story in the middle of all of that. It introduces so many new characters while also developing already known characters. Take Ganondorf for example. We already knew who he was and how dangerous he could be based on Ocarina of Time. But in this game we get to see an even more wicked, domineering version of Ganondorf, completely corrupted by his lust for power and conquest. What's crazy though, is that we actually don't realize that Ganondorf is the true antagonist of this game until much later in the story. We're led to believe that the antagonist is Zant, the usurper king of the Twilight, and that we have to stop him in order to remove the Twilight from Hyrule. The game completely convinced me that Zant was the main villain, and honestly, even if it was just Zant, I think the game still would have been a huge success. Like I said, Twilight Princess does such a good job at introducing new characters. Every character that's introduced has such a distinct personality and role in the story that they just stick with you. Characters like Ilia, Colin, Malo, Talo, and Beth really don't do too much in the grand scheme of things. But the role they play and the character development they exhibit through the game adds so much value to the overall story and experience. Knowing that Colin really just wants to be brave like his dad and Link really pulls at the heartstrings, and getting to see him exhibit that newfound bravery is such a cool moment, especially because it leads into one of the most iconic parts of Twilight Princess, the duel with King Bublin on the bridge. It really is the little things in this game that pull you in. The major characters of the Zelda series are also great in this game. What I found most interesting was that Zelda really had a much different role in this game. The goal of most Zelda games is to rescue Zelda, but it really doesn't feel that way in Twilight Princess. Zelda has so much more authority in this game, and we get to see her in action as an actual ruler of the kingdom. So, if we aren't responsible for rescuing Zelda, what drives us to try to stop the antagonist? Well, Midna, the little Twilight imp that helps us escape Hyrule Castle dungeon. It turns out that Midna, this seemingly insignificant little imp, knows much more about what's going on in Hyrule than we do, and she serves as the catalyst and direction for all of our decision making throughout the entire game. She also exerts authority, and that adds a layer of mystery to her character. As we progress through the game, we learn a lot more and get to see her grow as a leader. I won't go into too much detail, but her character development between when we first met her and the end of the game is so incredible. In terms of companion characters, I think Midna is the best one we've seen in the series thus far. From a gameplay perspective, Twilight Princess definitely keeps the Zelda format that fans know and love, but it also introduces several unexpected and enjoyable features that provide multiple layers to the game. I'll get to the main mechanic in a minute, but there are a couple other things that the game introduces that I just wanted to say I thought were cool. I really liked sumo wrestling Gorons, flying through caves on Twilight Beasts, and snowboarding down icy mountains. These little extra layers or levels that were added in the game gave the game a little more individuality and added to the fun. I didn't expect to be doing these things when I first started the game, so when I came across them, I thought it was a pleasant little surprise. Anyways, pivoting back to the main new mechanic that this game introduced, Wolf Link. In many Zelda games, Link travels between different worlds, different times, different surfaces of the kingdom, but I think Twilight Princess is the only game that Link transforms into an animal. Wait, scratch that, there is one other time. But seriously, I think this is the only time the main mechanic of a Zelda game involves Link transforming into an animal. This transformation is unique to the game, and I think the way it's integrated into the story is awesome. I love the fact that since Link is a wolf, he can hone into his heightened senses to track people, and the way the game uses Wolf Link to develop Midna as a character is great too. The mechanic is unusual but solid, and it definitely gives Twilight Princess a unique identity. I mean, imagine the game without Wolf Link. All in all, Twilight Princess is an extremely solid entry in the Zelda series. I know many people who consider it their favorite Zelda game. I personally considered it an absolute blast, and I still remember frantically trying to beat it because I needed to return it to Connor. That final battle against Ganondorf was phenomenal, and I love how serious it felt. I mean, like I've said, the atmosphere in this game is insane. Unfortunately, like with Breath of the Wild, all good things must come to an end. But thankfully, when I finished Twilight Princess and returned it to Connor, I already had my hands on my next Zelda game, the very original Legend of Zelda. Up to this point, I had only played 3D Zelda games. I never played a 2D Zelda game unless you count Spirit Tracks, so I figured now would be a good time to start. And you know what? Why not start with the very first 2D Zelda game and the first game in the series? I wasn't necessarily planning on playing Zelda 1 next. The opportunity just kind of popped up while I was walking through Target on a date night with my girlfriend. That's right, we do date nights at Target. Don't judge us, Target's the best. While we were walking past the game section, I looked over and I saw an NES Classic in the cabinet underneath the kiosk. I checked it out and saw it had a bunch of old games including Zelda 1 and 2. It was only like $60 and my pockets were burning, so I ended up buying it. I'm so glad I did because now I could have a more authentic experience playing the original Zelda game. I was still finishing up Twilight Princess at the time, but as soon as I finished up Twilight Princess in November of 2018, I started Zelda 1. Honestly, I went into Zelda 1 with very low expectations. Considering it came out 30 years ago, I really didn't get my hopes up that I'd enjoy it in the same way I enjoyed the other Zelda games I'd played thus far. That being said, I was still super excited to play it. I mean, it was the OG Zelda game. This is where it all started, and I was getting to play it on the NES Classic. I'd never played a NES, and so it felt really weird holding the controller. I really felt like I was traveling back in time to a whole different era to play this game. To add to this different era experience, I actually even printed off the map for this game and took notes while I played. Whenever I found a dungeon, I'd write it down on the map. Whenever I found a secret, I'd make notes about what was said or what I found. I felt like I was on my own adventure through the world, like it was my responsibility to remember where certain things were so I could go back to them in the future. See, that's one of my complaints with certain games nowadays. It feels like there's so much hand-holding and that these games are constantly showing you where you need to go instead of letting you forge your own path. I think this is especially prevalent in the Pokemon series. If you compare Pokemon Generations 5 and below to Generations 6, 7, and 8, I think the hand-holding is obvious. I'll save my rant for another day, but if I can't play a game for more than 5 minutes without a generic group of NPC friends stopping me, healing my team, and going through unnecessary and generic dialogue, then I'm probably not going to keep playing the game. Suffice to say, I like being able to forge my own path, and the independence that you have in Zelda 1 really makes it feel like you're doing that. I think a lot of what feels like independence in this game is actually the result of hardware limitations that this game had when it came out 30 years ago. Honestly though, sometimes limitations are good. It's no secret that the developers of Breath of the Wild took a lot of inspiration from Zelda 1, so the independence you feel in Breath of the Wild is incredibly reminiscent to Zelda 1. The only difference is that in Breath of the Wild, the developers weren't limited by the NES. They could take the independence that they established in Zelda 1 and infinitely expand it on the Wii U and the Switch. Zelda 1's limitations created the independence that became Breath of the Wild's inspiration. I'm honestly so excited to see how they expand on this even further as we go into the skies of Hyrule and Tears of the Kingdom. I've gone on a rabbit trail though, moving back to Zelda 1. Like I said, I went in with low expectations. I've always had a personal frustration with older games and how they control compared to new games. Not every single game, but many of the older games I've tried out have felt clunky, outdated, and overly complex. I don't know, maybe I only like the controls of games I played while I was growing up. I figured I probably wouldn't be a fan of Zelda 1 for this very reason, but boy was I wrong. Zelda 1 is simply perfect. And when I say that, I mean it's simple, and that it's perfect. The NES controller has a single D-pad, as well as A, B, start, and select buttons. The game controls just how you think it should with those controls in mind. Link can move up, down, left, and right, and he can use A for his sword and B for his items. You can access the map, pause the game, and switch items using the start and select buttons. The system is simple, and it makes jumping into the game really easy. There is no tutorial, no unnecessarily complex and unintuitive controls. You just pick up the controller and intuitively figure out what to do. From a gameplay perspective, things are also initially simple and intuitive at first, but then they become more complicated as you progress. Starting out, you wander into a cave, get the sword, and start your adventure exploring and fighting monsters. Eventually you'll find your way over to level 1, aka the first dungeon. As you progress past this point, you'll encounter puzzles and be challenged to find dungeons or other secrets throughout the world. As things become more complicated though, you'll also become stronger and equipped with more items to help solve the puzzles. You see, this game follows the same Zelda formula as the other games I've mentioned thus far. Actually, scratch that. This game is the Zelda formula. This is where the entire series began. It set the standard for what a Zelda game is. As I was playing the game for the first time, I began to recognize this, and I was honestly so surprised. For over 30 years, the series has managed to stay true to the general formula that made this game so special. It's no wonder that the Zelda series has become increasingly more popular. It has such a strong foundation. The Zelda series built its house on bedrock, and to this day, over 35 years later, it still stands strong. I was so impressed by Zelda 1 when I played it. The world, dungeons, the puzzles, and all the secrets that are spread throughout the map give the game so much depth. The game blew away all my expectations and helped me understand why Zelda is such an iconic series. Having just finished Zelda 1, I had now established a standard for what to expect out of 2D Zelda games. The only other Zelda game I had access to at that point though was Zelda 2, and I'd heard it was kind of a dark horse in the Zelda series. I decided to hold off on playing Zelda 2 and decided that I would play a different Zelda game next. The only question was which one was next. Well, at that point it was January of 2019 and my buddies and I had big plans to see the Dragon Ball Super Broly movie when it came out in theaters. My friends drove to the city that I went to school in so that we could all watch it together, and while we were there, we also visited a couple game stores. I was telling my friends that I didn't know what Zelda game to play next, and Rodavia recommended A Link to the Past because it was his favorite in the series. As it happens, one of the game stores we went to had the GBA copy of A Link to the Past plus 4 Swords for really cheap. They also had A Link Between Worlds, and Connor, Rodavia, and Nick also recommended that one. Spurred on by my friends, I decided to buy both A Link to the Past 4 Swords and A Link Between Worlds. The best part was that it only cost me like $25, which for both of those, I think that's a great deal. After my buddies went home, I started playing A Link to the Past. Since I was playing the Game Boy Advance version, I played it on my Nintendo DS Lite. I didn't have a Game Boy Advance at the time, and honestly, even if I did, I think I would have played the game on my DS Lite, since the screen is so much better. Regardless, I had an absolute blast playing this game, and I thought it was an amazing challenge. I remember the game being hard, but not too hard. It was the perfect difficulty in that I was always on my toes and always thinking. A Link to the Past was also the first game in the series that I think got heavy with the lore, and the story was really good. If I'm remembering right, this was even the first game to introduce the Seven Sages, a group that gets greatly expanded on in Ocarina of Time and future games. Zelda also plays a much larger role in this game than she did in Zelda 1 or 2, and knowing Zelda's significance in the greater story gives her character a depth that she didn't have in the earlier games. Rather than just being a princess in distress, she's an extremely powerful and influential character in the game. Moving on to the antagonist though, Aghanim is a very cool character, and he carried an aura of mystery about him for the majority of the game. Come to think of it, he was also the first secondary antagonist, or minion of the main antagonist. Much like how Zant was being used by Ganondorf in Twilight Princess, Aghanim is used by Ganon. See, the Zelda series likes to do stuff like this, They introduce a villain at the beginning of the story, but then as you get closer to the end, they go, "This isn't even my final form," and introduce us to the real main baddie of the game. Honestly, I have no qualms with this strategy, and I think it strengthens the series by adding more depth and introducing more unique characters. A Link to the Past was also the first game to introduce a unique, game-specific mechanic in the form of the Dark World. In the same way that in Ocarina of Time, Link would play the ocarina and travel between the future and the past, in A Link to the Past, Link travels between the light and dark world via various portals spread throughout each world. The light and dark worlds were so cool because they were different but the same. When traveling between worlds, you'd notice certain similarities in landscape, but oftentimes you had to follow different paths to get to those specific areas depending on which world you were in. You don't access the dark world until a little later in the game too, and there's a pretty large difficulty spike when you get into the dark world. Suddenly areas where you'd be able to beat enemies easily are filled with stronger, more durable enemies, and you're fighting for your life just to get to the next screen. Like I mentioned though, A Link to the Past is the perfect difficulty, and the Dark World is a great example of this. Sure, you're having to fight stronger enemies, but as you beat them and find new dungeons, you become more equipped to beat those stronger enemies. Eventually, by the end of the game, you'll have no problems fighting all the different baddies you'll face throughout the Dark World. But when you get to the final boss and fight a certain reincarnation of evil, boy is that fight harder than anything you've ever done before. But again, like I said, A Link to the Past is the perfect difficulty. Of course Ganon would be the hardest fight in the game. Of course he would come across as an overpowering beast of a boss. That's exactly what he is. The game did an amazing job establishing and maintaining the power dynamic between Link, the world, and his enemies. By the time I finally swung my blade for the last time, defeating Ganon, I was so satisfied and overcome with excitement. In addition to perfectly maintaining the power dynamic, A Link to the Past also does an awesome job at conveying the tone of the game through its music. This may be a hot take, but I think the 16-bit SNES music is better than a lot of video game music nowadays. Maybe I'm just a sucker for retro-sounding music, but I don't know. What I do know though is that if you force me to choose between music in A Link to the Past and Pokemon Gen 5, I might have a hard time choosing which one I like more. Okay, it's tough to beat Gen 5 Pokemon, but that should tell you how good the music in A Link to the Past is. Prior to A Link to the Past, The Legend of Zelda was very limited in the number of tracks it could use due to the power of the NES, but on the Super Nintendo you can tell the Zelda team wanted to go all out with the music. There's so many bangers in A Link to the Past, and each track sets the mood perfectly. They give the game so much more emotion, and honestly, when a game has good music, it just becomes more fun. I mentioned the light and the dark worlds earlier. Well, each world has its own musical score that plays while adventuring through the main part of the world. In the light world, the main Zelda theme plays, and you feel like you're on a fun, familiar adventure. However, in the dark world, a new, never-been-heard track plays, and this one makes you feel heroic. The Dark World theme is so iconic, and as a player, it really does spur you on, lift you up, and give you the courage to keep exploring through the unknown, so that you can overcome the difficult challenge before you. A Link to the Past was my second 2D Zelda game, and it was so much more sophisticated than the original Legend of Zelda. I could totally tell why A Link to the Past is Brodavia's favorite game, and I'm so glad that he suggested it to me. Having just finished my adventure as the pink-haired bunny Link, I was ready for my next adventure in Hyrule. Or was I? Maybe my next Zelda adventure needed to take place outside of the Kingdom of Hyrule, and maybe outside of reality itself. I remember sitting in my dorm room watching the February 2019 Nintendo Direct and being absolutely astonished when Nintendo announced that they were remaking Link's Awakening for Nintendo Switch. I just recently learned about Link's Awakening on Game Boy and Game Boy Color, and I thought it sounded like a really interesting twist on the Zelda series. But after Nintendo's announcement, I decided I really wanted to play this game. The only problem was that the remake wasn't coming out until a year later, and I needed a new Zelda game to play now. Well, Valentine's Day happened to be the very next day after Nintendo announced the Link's Awakening remake. Whether through complete chance or out of pure love and thoughtfulness, my girlfriend surprised me with Link's Awakening DX as a Valentine's gift. I couldn't believe it. It was like she had read my mind, knowing that I wanted to play this game. I remember her telling me that she was worried I wouldn't be excited since Nintendo had just announced the remake, but I assured her that I couldn't have been even more the opposite. I was so excited to play the Game Boy game because I wanted to play it as it was originally intended before I played the remake. So that's what I did. I decided to play Link's Awakening in the most authentic way possible, on the original hardware. My girlfriend had gotten me the Game Boy Color version, Link's Awakening DX. So I dusted off my Game Boy Color, inserted the cartridge, and traveled back in time to before handhelds had lights on their screen, and you had to go and position yourself perfectly under a lamp so that you could see the game you were playing. Honestly, I'm so glad I played the game this way. It was so nostalgic. I really felt like I was a kid again. I remember beating the game while lying on the floor of my room, because that's where I could see the screen best with the way my lamp was shining. Replacing the AA batteries every several hours because the Game Boy Color didn't have a charger reminded me what playing games was like back when I was a kid. I feel like playing games this way gave me a greater appreciation for the convenience of games nowadays. Backlit screens, battery chargers, heck, more than just a couple of buttons and a D-pad. The way we play games has evolved so much over the last 20 or so years, and playing Link's Awakening on my old Game Boy Color really made me appreciate that. If you have the means to do it, I totally recommend going back and playing an old Game Boy game on original hardware. It'll be a really fun and eye-opening experience. Anyways, back to the reason you clicked this video, to learn more about my crippling Zelda addiction. So like I said, I played Link's Awakening DX on my Game Boy Color. I really didn't know what to expect from this game. I knew it was uniquely different and that it was set in a different world than Hyrule, and that certain Mario characters even made appearances in the game, such as Chain Chomps and Goombas. Honestly, this information didn't really prepare me for much. Knowing those facts doesn't give you any actual idea of the depth and individuality of this game. Link's Awakening is unlike any other Zelda game I've played. Koholint is so charming, and all of the kooky characters throughout the game are such a joy to meet and interact with. As I played the game, I really gained a familiarity for the island and all the locals. The friendship you form with Marin is so special, and honestly the same goes for all the other relationships you form throughout the island, especially if you do the trading side quests, since you see even more personal sides of all the characters on the island. Unfortunately though, this makes beating the game that much harder, because as it's revealed throughout the story, none of this is real. Koholint Island lies outside the realm of reality. All it is a dream, and Link's trapped in it. As you learn that the goal of the game is to escape the Windfish's dream and return to reality, you start to dread that moment when the game ends because you don't want to lose this charming world and all the relationships you've made in it. Just like when you're actually having a really good dream, you don't want to wake up yet because you know that waking up means ending the dream and returning to the real world. It means that all the real world burdens are going to return, and that you have to get up and take responsibility of your life once again. The charm is gone, the dream has ended, and now it's just back to regular life. Only it's not. You see, I don't think that dreams are meant to be infinite, and I don't think that an infinite dream would be quite as satisfying as you might think it would be. I think that dreams are meant to motivate, dreams are meant to inspire, dreams encourage creativity. This might be strange, but recently I had a dream that I was playing Tears of the Kingdom. The game isn't out yet, but in my dream it was, and I was having such a blast playing it. In my dream I had created my own world and I was adventuring through it. Sure, it was fun, but the best part was waking up and realizing, wow, if this is what dreaming about the game feels like, imagine what actually playing it will be like when it comes out. I personally think that in a lot of ways dreams develop us as people. And I think that the ending of Link's Awakening is a perfect example of that. As we see Koholint Island fade away, there's a general sense of sadness. We've woken up from the dream, but as we see the Windfish fly over us, accompanied by seagulls, we remember that Marin dreamed of flying through the skies like a seagull. We remember all the unique interactions we had with the inhabitants of the island, and we remember all the ways we were challenged, and how we overcame those challenges to escape the dream and return to reality. This dream offered so much opportunity to learn and to grow, to develop and to overcome. This is what it's all about. Now we can return to reality with a new sense of motivation, inspiration, and creativity. I think that's what we see in Link at the end of Link's Awakening, and I think that it's the perfect way that this game could end. Link's Awakening has a truly beautiful story, and I think it has so much more depth than I even covered here. I don't need to go into all of that though, especially because this video is already going to be ridiculously long, and I have to edit all of it. Before I move on to the next game though, I want to briefly share my perspective on two more topics: Link's Awakening's gameplay, and how the Switch remake compares to the original. Considering Link's Awakening came out on Game Boy, it has surprisingly good gameplay mechanics. I think the Zelda team really got everything they could out of the Game Boy when making this game, and personally, out of all the Game Boy or Game Boy Color Zelda games, I think that Link's Awakening feels the best to play. I do have one nitpick, and honestly, there's nothing the Zelda team could have done at the time to change it. Link has so many weapons that he has to switch between, but there are only two buttons for items, A and B. When you play this game, you'll constantly be switching items, and in order to do that, you have to go to the pause screen and assign an item to each button. Honestly though, like I said earlier, the Zelda team really seemed to have gotten everything they could out of the Game Boy, and I think that this is just one of those unfortunate limitations caused by the Game Boy itself. Fortunately, many years later, in October of 2019, Nintendo fixed this problem with the Link's Awakening remake on Switch. The limitations of the Game Boy hardware were completely gone, and the Zelda team was able to modernize the game. With plenty of buttons to spare on the Switch, gone were the days of constantly switching between items. The Switch remake was honestly perfect. The toy-like style and childish tone of the game were surprising at first, but when I thought about the context and the fact that the game is set in a dream filled with silly and eccentric characters, I realized that this was the perfect style and tone for the game. Playing the Link's Awakening remake was such a dramatic change of pace for me, considering I'd played the original Link's Awakening on Game Boy Color. I didn't have to stare at a tiny screen or sit uncomfortably to position myself under a light. The remake was on the Switch, so I was able to play it lounged out in my bed, kicked back in my chair, at my desk, handheld, docked, virtually however I wanted to. Whenever someone asks me about Link's Awakening and if they should play it, I'll always recommend the Switch remake for these reasons. Although, now that Nintendo Switch Online has Game Boy games, you can play the original Link's Awakening on Switch too, so honestly, why not both? I'm so glad that I played the original before the remake, and Nintendo has really done a great job at enabling Zelda fans to do that nowadays. Link's Awakening is really a special game in the Zelda series, and I'm glad it's gotten the love that it deserves. Okay, I've spent a fair amount of time on Link's Awakening, so now I think I'll go ahead and move on to another fan favorite of the Zelda series. This game is one I personally have very mixed feelings about because I had a hard time finishing it. It's one that I kept picking up and putting down, never getting fully invested enough to blitz through it. I started the game in June of 2019, but I didn't finish it until November of 2020. It took me close to a year and a half to beat this game, and it's the first, but certainly not the last, Zelda game that I took breaks in between playing because I was more interested in other games. So, what is this Zelda game that I just couldn't get invested in? Well, it may sound blasphemous when I say it, so brace yourselves. The first Zelda game that I'm going to talk negatively about on this list is actually The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask. Okay, I know what many of y'all are thinking. I've just completely lost all credibility. Not that there was much to begin with. Who does this David Tort guy think he is talking smack about Majora's Mask, the sequel to Ocarina of Time and many people's favorite Zelda game? Well, let me comfort you and say that I actually did love Majora's Mask. I think it's a great game. But like I said, I had a lot of trouble getting invested in it. I'll have plenty of positive things to say about Majora's Mask here in a bit, but let me speak my piece and give you the reasons that this game failed to leave an impression on me at first. And let me tell you, brace yourselves, because it's about to get a little deeper in here over the next couple of minutes. A little background on me is that my family and I are very close. Nearly all of my family and extended family live in and around the same city. And it's been that way for just about my entire life. Likewise, my girlfriend has also lived in that same city for her whole life. When the two of us moved away for college, the school that we went to was in a different city, but it was honestly still close enough to our family that we never really felt like we were far from home. We also had each other and a good group of friends, so the slight distance from home was never really a problem. I'm truly blessed to have such great friends and family, and in June of 2019, I really began to realize the true extent of how important that was. You see, I had an opportunity to do a summer internship, and it was in an entirely different city and state. I was really excited about it, and all my family was super supportive. So you're probably wondering, what does all this have to do with Majora's Mask and my problems with it? Well, when I moved, at first I was excited and enjoyed exploring the small town I was living in, as well as the major city that was nearby. But after a couple of weeks, I started to get lonely. I was exploring all these new places and experiencing all of these new things, but I was all alone. I missed my family, friends, and especially my girlfriend, and I really started to feel like I didn't have anyone in my life. I brought several video games with me since I figured I'd have a lot of free time while I was away, so I picked up my 3DS and started playing Majora's Mask. Honestly, I was really unprepared for the somber and almost depressing tone of this game. Majora's Mask is full of fun and quirky characters, but the overarching mood of this game is sad. Every character seems to be struggling in some form or fashion, and the game really makes this abundantly clear by establishing that everyone and everything is about to be destroyed in 3 days when the moon crashes down onto the land of Termina. Naturally, Link is the hero, and it's his job to rescue Termina from this foreboding calamity, but even Link is dealing with his own crisis. See, Link's adventures started after his friend Navi left him at the end of Ocarina of Time. Link missed his friend and went out in search of her, but he found himself all alone in a new land, without any of his loved ones. Just like me. This is why I had a problem with Majora's Mask at first, because I could relate to it too much at the time. Being all alone in a new place was very difficult for me, and I had a hard time at first because I'd gone from being surrounded by everyone I cared about to being completely alone, surrounded by people who couldn't care less about me. When I tried to distract myself by playing a new Zelda game, I just found myself in the exact same position I was in real life. It's because of this that I had to put down Majora's Mask and stop playing it for a while. So there you go. That's why I had a hard time playing Majora's Mask. I think because I couldn't get fully invested in the beginning, I had a really hard time being invested in it whenever I tried picking it up again. And I think that's why it took me so long to beat the game. Every time I tried playing it, I was almost reminded of what it was like to be all alone. But anyways, enough of that deep emotional talk though, because on the flip side, the tone and the fact that I was able to relate to it so much is what makes Majora's Mask a great game in my opinion. I mean, talk about putting yourself in the shoes of someone else. I could really feel everything that this game was trying to convey. Looking back on it, I think that my somber experience with Majora's Mask is cool, because I was able to experience the game in a way that I never would have had I not been in that situation. Also, in the end, I was able to return home, and I was able to be with all my loved ones again. My story ended on a very positive note. Now, to actually talk more about Majora's Mask as a video game, I think anyone who enjoyed Ocarina of Time would really enjoy Majora's Mask. Mechanically, it uses all the same assets from Majora's Mask, and it functions perfectly as a sequel. The story is completely different, and it's set in a new land, so it really feels like a true extension to Ocarina of Time. I really like 3 specific things about the game, those being the dungeons, time control mechanics, and the masks. If you enjoy the dungeons in Ocarina of Time, I think you'll really enjoy the dungeons in Majora's Mask. While there aren't as many, I think the Zelda team put everything they could into these dungeons. Each dungeon is memorable, and they all have their own mechanics that give them unique identity. Between the puzzles, bosses, and the dungeon-specific mechanics, you get to use every mask and every item just enough that it feels like none are more important than the other. I know that's something that some Zelda games struggle with, and I think that Majora's Mask isn't one of those games. The time control mechanic has been used in several Zelda games over the years, but I think that Majora's Mask uses it best. Since the game takes place over a 3-day span, time is limited, and being able to use the Ocarina of Time to speed up, slow down, or reverse time is a perfect way to combat that 3-day limit. I love the fact that the Ocarina of Time is able to play such a huge role in Majora's Mask, given that it's the sequel to the game named after the iconic musical instrument. The Ocarina of Time adds a whole other level of depth and strategy to the game. Sure, at times it may feel like it eliminates the gravity of the situation, since you know you can always escape the impending calamity of the moon falling, but at the same time, it offers hope and confidence that you can escape and that you can save Termina. The last mechanic that I really love about Majora's Mask is its namesake, the masks. Each mask in the game offers some unique power for Link to have at his disposal. Some powers are more valuable than others, some are optional to obtain, but others are required and a major part of the story. Masks add so much to the depth of the story and gameplay. Being able to float around as a Deku, swim as a Zora, and roll around as a Goron are so fun. And those are abilities from only 3 of the 24 masks available in the game. The coolest part of the mask system in my opinion though is that if you collect all 23 acquirable masks, you can actually get the 24th mask, the Fierce Deity mask. This mask is such a mystery, and it makes Link nearly invincible when fighting Majora at the end of the game. All in all, Majora's Mask is an incredible game, and I'm sure that when I go back and play it again, I'll enjoy it far more than I did when I played it originally. That said, like I mentioned, when I played Majora's Mask, I was really able to relate to Link and his unique situation in the story. I think there's something special in that, and even though I didn't enjoy it at first, looking back, I really had a unique experience that totally amplified my feelings about this game. If you haven't already played Majora's Mask, you totally should. Just know that if you do, you might find yourself getting a little contemplative or introspective about your own life, just like I did. So, I mentioned that Majora's Mask took me about a year and a half to beat, and in that time I actually managed to beat a couple other Zelda games. The first of these is another game that I'll have a couple negative things to mention, although let me go ahead and say that anything negative I have to say I actually think was fixed in a future release of this game. In fact, I think that this particular game is one of my favorites in the entire series at this point. So without further ado, let's get into The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword. Being another amazing Christmas present from my girlfriend, I started playing Skyward Sword in January of 2020. I played the Wii game on my Wii U, and actually, if you've been following the Torque Force for a while, you'd know that this is one of the first games we actually streamed on our channel. Looking back on when I originally played this game, I have so many great memories. The game is super linear, and I thought I wouldn't enjoy it since I usually enjoy games where exploration is the focus. In Skyward Sword though, the story is so good and there's so many things to do in the world that I really didn't notice the game's linearity. From a timeline perspective, Skyward Sword is the first game in the series, and it serves as the origin for the Master Sword as well as the catalyst for future games in the series. The game's set in the sky, but you quickly realize that you'll be doing a lot of traveling between the surface and the skies above. That sounds a lot like a certain game coming out on May 12th of 2023. A lot of the game involves forging the Master Sword and searching for Zelda after failing to save her when she falls and goes missing. That sounds kinda like a certain game coming out on May 12th, 2023. What I'm trying to say here is that I think Skyward Sword is going to be really relevant to Tears of the Kingdom, and I think that if you haven't played Skyward Sword yet, you might want to get to it before Tears of the Kingdom comes out. So I mentioned that I originally played the Wii version of this game, and I had an absolute blast with it. However, I also mentioned that I had some qualms with this game. Honestly, my only qualm is with the controls though. See, Skyward Sword is really cool in that the Wii remote functions as your sword. You get to swing the remote around just like how you'd swing a sword, but unfortunately the Wii remote wasn't the most accurate when it came to understanding which direction you were swinging. Because of this, swinging the sword around became far more frustrating than fun, and this quote, feature of the game became much more of an unwelcome gimmick. When I originally played the game, I remember several times where I got really frustrated with the wonky controls, and honestly that frustration just made me want to be done with the game entirely. Like I said though, my issues with this game were completely fixed when Skyward Sword HD came out on Nintendo Switch. The Switch version of the game not only optimized the motion controls, but it also offered handheld controls by using the right joystick to swing the sword. Both control modes are great, and they really help return the focus to the game's amazing story and fun gameplay. All the characters in Skyward Sword are so lovable, and each of them has a unique role to play in the game. The entire Skyloft community have unique personalities regardless of how minor of a role they play. They're all unforgettable. Major characters like Link, Zelda, Impa, and of course Fi all have such cool roles in the story. The character that really shines in Skyward Sword to me though is Groose of all characters. His growth and maturity through the game is so fun to see, and ironically this oaf of a man who resembles Gaston from Beauty and the Beast far too much somehow becomes one of the best and most influential characters in the entire game. Groose is truly iconic. Skyward Sword also equips Link with one of the coolest arsenals I've ever seen in the Zelda series. Items like the beetle, gust bellows, and the whip are all futuristic, and they add to the mystery of the game. How is it that the first game in the timeline, the chronological origin of the Zelda series, has such futuristic items? This game has a lot of technological mystery, and devices such as these items and the time shift stones really give the game so much more depth. This technological mystery is something that Breath of the Wild even expands on with the Sheikah Slate, Divine Beasts, and the Master Cycle. I really think that Tears of the Kingdom is going to greatly expand on all of this. I mean heck, in the trailer we see Link driving around in a Zonai car, flying on some kind of hovercraft, and floating upwards in a hot air balloon. The technological mystery introduced in Skyward Sword has really provided the Zelda series with so much new content that the team can work with to make the series that much better. Even though Breath of the Wild really feels like a breath of fresh air and the revival of the Zelda series, I don't think it would have been possible without Skyward Sword. Skyward Sword really set up Breath of the Wild to be as successful as it was because of what it introduced. Things like the sailcloth and the stamina wheel in Skyward Sword are the reason that we got the paraglider and the stamina system in Breath of the Wild. Think about it. Without Skyward Sword, we might not have been able to sprint around, climb, or paraglide through the world in Breath of the Wild. Breath of the Wild would have been an entirely different game had it not been for Skyward Sword, so really, Skyward Sword can be thought of as the true revival of the Zelda series, even if at its heart it was a quote, traditional Zelda game. There's so much more that could be unpacked and discussed about Skyward Sword, but I'll save that for another day. There's still many Zelda games that we've got to talk about, and the script for this video is now up to about 20 pages, so as I transition to the next game, I'll quickly note that it's one that's entirely different in scope, but it has a lot of similarities to Skyward Sword that I noticed while playing it. It was one of the few Zelda games developed by Capcom, and maybe I noticed these similarities because of the involvement of former Capcom and current Nintendo director, Hidemaru Fujibayashi. The next Zelda game we'll be discussing is my favorite of the 2D Zelda games, The Legend of Zelda: The Minish Cap. Once again, I have the best girlfriend ever, and in February of 2020, my girlfriend surprised me with the Minish Cap for Valentine's Day. I had had my eye on the Minish Cap for a while, but it was so hard to find, and it was always overpriced. I was always passing up on buying it when I saw it in game stores because of that, so needless to say, I was super hyped when she gave it to me. Now, I'm gonna be honest, I'm a sucker for the Game Boy Advance. Would it really be a Torque Force video if I didn't mention the Game Boy Advance was my first ever game system, and the first game I ever played was Dragon Ball Z: The Legacy of Goku 2. The Game Boy Advance is my absolute favorite, and I've got so many great memories with it. So now that I've established I have a bit of a bias for the Game Boy Advance, let me get into why the Minish Cap is my current favorite 2D Zelda game, as well as one of the best games in the entire series. In my opinion, there are several reasons why this game sits at the summit of 2D Zelda games, but they can really be narrowed to two primary topics: the main mechanic of this game and the legacy that the Minish Cap left on the Zelda series as a whole. One of the unique things about Zelda games is how each does a good job at establishing its own unique and independent identity. One of the ways that the Zelda team is able to do this with each game is by introducing game-specific mechanics. Mechanics such as traveling between the light and dark worlds in A Link to the Past, moving back and forth in time in Ocarina of Time, and controlling the wind as you sail around the sea in the Windwaker. Nearly every Zelda game has its own unique mechanic which helps set it apart, and the Minish Cap is no exception. What's unique about the Minish Cap though is that nothing new was really introduced. There's no second world or mystic item that can alter the time or wind. Rather, in the Minish Cap, the unique mechanic introduced is a new perspective. In the Minish Cap, Link gets to look at the world differently than ever before. You see, in this game, a new race of people is introduced called the Minish. Also called the Picori, the Minish are a race of tiny creatures that live alongside the Hylians and other inhabitants of Hyrule. Often unnoticed due to their size, the Minish live all across Hyrule, some even in large towns like Castletown. They use everyday items like shoes and books to create homes, and something like a little puddle on the side of the road might seem like a large lake to them. They see the world completely differently than everyone else in Hyrule, and that's where the unique mechanic of this game comes in. See, as fate would have it, Link meets Eslo, a Minish sage who is transformed into a hat by Vati, the antagonist of the game. Link and Eslo join forces, and Eslo gives Link the power to shrink down to the size of the Minish. So rather than use an Ocarina of Time or Sheikah Slate, or turn into a wolf or painting or travel to an alternate dimension, Link just becomes smaller. He hasn't gained any new power or control over the world around him. In fact, he's actually become weaker. Traversing the world is now more difficult, and like I mentioned, things like little puddles are now giant lakes. What Link does gain though, is the ability to more easily access and interact with the Minish. He can now go places like inside little mouse holes and find entire Minish communities living inside the walls of houses, tree trunks, or even bookshelves. By introducing the Minish and the ability to shrink to their size, the Zelda team created an entirely new world within the one we already know. They didn't have to create some new world to explore, they just had to change our perspective. And I think that's really the unique thing about this particular mechanic. I mentioned earlier that the Minish Cap has its own little legacy within the Zelda series. Well, the Minish Cap is actually the first of what could be considered a trilogy within the Zelda series. Unlike many Zelda games, the Minish Cap has its own unique protagonist who is independent from both Ganon and Demise's curse. That protagonist is Vati, and using the power of the Force Sword, Link's able to defeat Vati and seal him away within the Force Sword. If you're familiar with the Zelda series, you'll recognize that the Force Sword is actually mentioned in the names of a couple other Zelda games, those being The Legend of Zelda Four Swords and The Legend of Zelda Four Sword Adventures. Now, I'll talk in depth about both of those games later on in the video, but I think it's important to note that neither of these games likely would have happened if the Minish Cap hadn't laid the groundwork for them. At least I don't think the stories of either of the Four Sword games would have had as much significance or meaning had it not been for the Minish Cap. Even though both sequels were able to function independently from the Minish Cap, the fact that they're related in the overall story makes them so much more enjoyable to play. In addition to the Four Swords legacy, the Minish Cap also lays the groundwork for the future of the entire Zelda series with several items that it introduces. While several of the items in the Minish Cap are Zelda mainstays that have been introduced in previous games, the Minish Cap also introduces a few new items that actually in some form or fashion return in future games. The two that stand out to me are the Gust Jar and the Mole Mitts, which actually have renditions in Skyward Sword in the form of the Gust Bellows and the Magma Mitts. Maybe a result of Fujibayashi's influence on the series in the last several games, we see these iconic items that were introduced in the Minish Cap return in later Zelda games. These unique items are another legacy that the Minish Cap left behind, and they're a great reminder to me that the Zelda team is always looking to reuse good ideas and incorporate them into future games in the series. The last form of a legacy that the Minish Cap left behind is actually a major part of the story and a huge piece of lore within the Zelda series, that of the Sky Kingdom and its inhabitants. See, the Minish Cap was actually the first game in the Zelda series to directly introduce the fact that there's a kingdom in the sky and a group of people that live in it. Up to this point, a Sky Kingdom had never been established in the Zelda series. Think about that. The Sky Kingdom is one of the most iconic parts of the Zelda series now. Skyward Sword is literally all about the Sky Kingdom. Tears of the Kingdom is supposedly all about the Sky Kingdom. These games might not have existed had Minish Cap not introduced the idea of a Sky Kingdom. The Minish Cap is such a special game in the Zelda series. It introduces so much and astronomically amplifies the overall Zelda canon more than I think anyone quite realizes. It's definitely a game I recommend playing, and nowadays playing it is that much easier since it's on Nintendo Switch Online. If you've got the time, you should totally try to beat it before Tears of the Kingdom comes out, because you never know, the Minish might make an appearance in Tears of the Kingdom. After all, they were almost included in Breath of the Wild. Now, there is one thing I haven't mentioned about the Minish Cap, and it's that something really important happened while I was playing it. What is it that happened? Well, one fateful evening, myself and Brodavia had an idea, and that idea was that we thought it would be fun to start a YouTube channel. Brodavia reached out to Arcarius, another friend of ours, and in February of 2020, the three of us started a little YouTube channel called The Torque Force. We had some interesting ideas for various videos we could make and unique games we could stream, but unfortunately it took us a little bit of time to gain momentum with the Torque Force. Between the COVID-19 pandemic and me once again moving to a different city, we weren't able to all get together and act on our ideas. But in fall of 2020, Brodavia, Arcarius, and I were all back in the same city once again, and we were raring to get into some Torque Force shenanigans with our friends. So, in fall of 2020, we decided to stream the sequel to the Minish Cap, the first ever multiplayer Zelda game, The Legend of Zelda Four Swords. Before I get into talking about Four Swords, I want to tell you about something else that happened right before my buddies and I played this game. It's completely unrelated to Four Swords, but it was a major thing that happened in my life that's technically related to this story. You know the girlfriend who I've mentioned several times? The one who so kindly gifted me several of the games we've discussed so far? Well, in fall of 2020, I proposed to her. Surprisingly, she still loved me despite my ever-growing addiction to The Legend of Zelda, and when I popped the question, she said yes. So I guess this is proof that if you buy your significant other Zelda games, they will want to marry you. Jokes aside, this was a major milestone in our lives, and I included it because of my girlfriend's, my fiance's, influence on both my life and my mission to beat every Zelda game. Back to Four Swords though. A little background on The Legend of Zelda Four Swords is that it came out originally in December of 2002 for the Game Boy Advance. The game was actually included in the Game Boy Advance release of A Link to the Past, and I honestly thought it was just some kind of bonus feature or minigame when I first bought A Link to the Past for Game Boy Advance. Turns out, it was actually its own independent game within the Legend of Zelda series, so if you want to play both A Link to the Past and Four Swords, you can kill two birds with one stone and get them both for Game Boy Advance. You can also find it in game stores or on eBay for super cheap. I'm pretty sure I got my copy of the game for like $10 tops. One thing you do need to know about The Legend of Zelda Four Swords though is that it's one of the hardest Zelda games to play. Why is that? Well, you can't actually play it unless you have 4 people. In fact, you need 4 people with 4 Game Boy Advances, with 4 copies of the game, with link cables to connect all 4 of those Game Boys. You cannot play this game single player. If you're like me and trying to beat all the Zelda games in the series before Tears of the Kingdom comes out, then Four Swords is definitely one of those games that makes it more difficult to do so. Thankfully, I was able to play this game with my friends, and we had a great time doing it. I still remember sitting in my friend's living room, all huddled together because we could only sit as far apart from each other as our Game Boy Advance link cables would allow us. All in all, this game is fairly short, and we managed to beat it in just a couple of hours. Despite that though, I think Four Swords has a lot to offer, and it has just enough story content to hold its own as an independent title in the Zelda series. Like I said earlier, the fact that it's related to the Minish Cap certainly helps give the game more significance. Bati is the main antagonist of Four Swords, so this is the second time we get to see him in the series. Knowing his backstory and the threat that he was in the Minish Cap makes his presence so much more menacing and his actions much more threatening. Additionally, I think using the Four Sword as a way to introduce multiplayer was perfect, since in the Minish Cap, the Four Sword feature was very limited. From a gameplay perspective, The Legend of Zelda Four Swords is unlike anything I had seen in the Zelda series up to this point. I personally think a good way to describe the gameplay is that it's a multiplayer adventure where you take on various dungeon-like levels with your friends. The fact that the game is multiplayer makes it so different, and adds a really cool layer when it comes to solving puzzles. There are different items scattered throughout each level, and using those items you can solve different puzzles and get keys to progress through the level. Each Link is dressed in a different color tunic, and depending on what color Link you are, you might have different roles when solving puzzles or fighting bosses. You're also competing with your friends to see who can collect the most rupees, and at the end of each level, you and your friends get ranked from 1st to 4th place. Adding a layer of competition makes this game so much more fun, and it creates plenty of opportunity for hijinks and shenanigans, especially if you're playing with Brodavia. Being able to play Four Swords together with my friends made it so much more memorable, and I'll always have nostalgia for Four Swords. Unfortunately though, it was really short, and while it's still able to function as its own independent game, it's just barely able to do so. We had to put in a lot of effort to just make playing this game possible. Needing 4 Game Boy Advances, 4 copies of the game, and 3 Game Boy Advance link cables really limits your ability to play Four Swords. What's really cool though is that Game Boy Advance games are on Nintendo Switch Online now, and that opens up a perfect opportunity for Nintendo to almost re-release Four Swords on Switch. If they did, it gives Switch owners an opportunity to play Four Swords online with other people. In fact, maybe Nintendo would even be able to add a way to play the game in single player mode too. You never know. What I do know though is that the opportunity is there, and I think there are plenty of Zelda fans who have never played Four Swords who would enjoy giving it a try. I'm glad that I was able to play Four Swords how it originally meant to be played, all together in a room with my friends. The fact that we were all able to get together, play the game, and even stream it motivated us to try an even more ambitious Zelda game in the future, one that I'll be discussing later on in this video. Before we get to that particular game though, there are a few more Zelda games that I need to cover. At this point, it was January of 2021 and I'd returned to school after spending the last 8 or so months doing internships related to what I was studying. That semester I had a particularly stressful course load and nearly all of it was online since schools were still trying to figure out how to function during the pandemic. The Torque Force kind of became a bit of an outlet and a way to relieve stress from school. I'd been wanting to stream another Zelda game that I hadn't played yet, and I realized my options were starting to become limited since I had now played over half the games in the series. I decided to check out the Oracle games, but I wasn't sure which one to play first. See, the Oracle games came out on the Game Boy Color, and much like how the Pokemon series has variants in the form of Pokemon Red and Blue, Zelda came out with Game Boy Color variants in the form of Oracle of Ages and Oracle of Seasons. Unlike the Pokemon variants though, each of the Oracle games have their own unique stories which can actually be linked together to get a secret ending after beating both games. I ended up deciding to play Oracle of Seasons first because I thought it sounded more unique. I'm glad I chose to play Oracle of Seasons first for reasons I'll get into when I talk about Ages later on in this review. But what I can say right off the bat is that I think both games are a bit underwhelming, with Seasons being the more enjoyable of the two. So, when I played Oracle of Seasons, I played it on my GameCube's Game Boy Player. I'm glad I did because this not only allowed me to stream the game, but I was also able to play it on a big screen instead of a small Game Boy Color or Advanced screen. While I really enjoyed going back in time and playing Link's Awakening on my Game Boy Color, I honestly don't think I would have enjoyed Oracle of Seasons this way, because the game itself is more complicated. I also wanted to stream the game, and I was using video games as a way to relieve stress and cool off from school. I planned to play this game in the most comfortable way possible, and a tiny, unlit Game Boy screen was not that way. The Game Boy Player was honestly the best and most comfortable way to play this game, and if you're able to, definitely play this game on the big screen. I'm pretty sure Nintendo announced the Oracle games were coming to Nintendo Switch Online, so if you have a Switch and you want to play this game, that's going to be the new best way to do it. In fact, depending on when this video comes out, or when you watch it, the Oracle games might already be out on Switch. Moving on though, here are my thoughts on The Legend of Zelda Oracle of Seasons. Oracle of Seasons is a decent game that was probably a really good game when it came out. What I mean by that is that when this game originally came out in February of 2001 on the Game Boy Color, it was probably out of this world good. I mean, this game has a cool story, a large world, interesting game-specific mechanics, and an additional world kind of like the Dark World in A Link to the Past. For a Game Boy game, it manages to check off all the boxes that many of the top-notch Zelda games do. On pen and paper, Oracle of Seasons is a really good Zelda game. Where it falls short though, is outside of that pen and paper, on the Game Boy Color screen and hardware. Because of how ambitious this game is, the fact that it was made for a handheld as simple as a Game Boy Color means that it falls victim to the same problems that Link's Awakening had, specifically the lack of usable buttons. Constantly having to switch between items in a game of this scale gets very old. That said, I've already talked about why I don't like the lack of usable buttons previously, so I'll move on to a couple of other things that really grinded my gears about Oracle of Seasons, and those things are the difficulty and Link's movement. First, I'll talk about the movement, and let me give a quick disclaimer. Link's movement in Oracle of Seasons isn't really that bad. I just personally have a problem with it. See, Oracle of Seasons is a great example of taking one step forward and two steps back. While, like I said, it managed to check off all the boxes of a great Zelda game, it really handicapped itself with the overall gameplay. The first thing I noticed when I played this game was that Link moves completely differently in the Oracle series than he does in Link's Awakening, and the difference was not a good one. While it is normal for Link's movement to change between games, oftentimes the style and overall vibe of the game changes too. Think going from Windwaker to Twilight Princess. In both games, Link's movements are completely different, but the game styles are also completely different. Now think about going from Spirit Tracks to Phantom Hourglass, which we'll be discussing later on. Link's movements are the same, and the styles are the same. Now think about Link's Awakening and the Oracle games. The styles are the exact same, but the movements are different. The way I see it is this. It's okay to have a different movement between different games if the styles of the games are different, but if the overall style is the same, then the movement should also be the same. Think about if Nintendo decided to make Link run completely differently in Tears of the Kingdom than he did in Breath of the Wild. Actually, don't think about that. I don't want you to manifest that into reality. Seriously though, since the Oracle games came out on Game Boy Color, and since the style looks very similar to Link's Awakening, the difference in Link's movement was a bit off-putting to me, especially because the movement in the Oracle games is actually worse in my opinion, and I thought it really was just a step in the wrong direction. Moving on from Link's movement though, my other real issue with Oracle of Seasons was the difficulty. Sure, most of the game really wasn't that bad, but there were parts of it that I thought were much more difficult than any of the other Zelda games that I've played. One major part in particular was the final boss of the game. I remember streaming Oracle of Seasons and continuously losing to Onox, the final boss of the game. See, the boss fight was really unique, but it was also really hard if you ask me. I felt like I was following all the steps and doing everything I was supposed to be doing, but for some reason the game had an advantage over me and it was toying with me like it already knew that. Maybe I was just tired and frustrated, But there'd been a couple of other times throughout the game where I felt that way, and maybe hitting that point of frustration during the final boss just tipped me over the edge. For someone who is used to using Zelda games as a form of stress relief, the overall increased difficulty of this game was not really helping to relieve the stress that I thought it would. And trust me, you're going to hear that sentence a couple more times throughout this video. I mentioned my problems with Oracle of Seasons, but trust me when I tell you, it's still a good Zelda game. If you overlook all the bad things that I had to say about the game, you still get a fun little game on the Game Boy Color. It has lots of depth, fun gameplay, and a very unique mechanic in the form of changing the seasons. The story is also awesome, and the Link in this game is actually the same Link from A Link to the Past and Link's Awakening. There's actually so much to these games, and I'm honestly surprised that they managed to make it all work in a Game Boy Color cartridge. I mean, heck, I haven't even mentioned the animal companions or the ring system. This little Zelda game supposedly takes 15.5 hours to beat the main story, but if you're like me and enjoy exploring and doing side quests, you could easily stretch this game out far beyond that time. So really, my thoughts aside, Oracle of Seasons is a great and unique installment in the Legend of Zelda series. It introduces a lot of new content, and a lot of it can only be found in this game. When Oracle of Seasons inevitably comes out to Nintendo Switch Online, then I'll leave it up to you to decide whether you want to play it or not. Personally, even though I had some issues with the game, I would totally play it again if it came to Switch. Especially because now I'd be able to use the rewind function to make all of my deaths against Onox disappear. And with that, I finished yet another game within the Legend of Zelda series. Like I've mentioned, I was in the middle of my toughest semester of classes, and rather than bunker down and hit the books in my free time, I decided to take the extra time I had outside of school to play more Zelda. I promise I was a good student. I had just finished Oracle of Seasons, and at that point, I think Arcarius or Brodavia were streaming a different Zelda game on the channel, in addition to our infamous Pokemon Emerald Nuzlocke, which, shameless plug, can be found on our YouTube channel. I had to be a bit more flexible with my time since school was getting more intense, and there was plenty of other content being streamed on the channel, so I decided to play a game that I could play whenever and wherever I wanted. This particular game I think is secretly one of the best in the series, and it's the first Legend of Zelda game to win the Game of the Year award. That game is The Legend of Zelda: A Link Between Worlds. Outside of all the remakes, re-releases, multiplayers, and spin-off Zelda games that came out on the 3DS, it's really the only new traditional Zelda game that came out on the system. Being a spiritual successor to A Link to the Past, A Link Between Worlds completely reuses the original overworld from A Link to the Past, as well as many other features from the SNES Classic. A lot of the music, characters, and items are all very similar to A Link to the Past, so if you enjoy that game, you're bound to enjoy this one. I really enjoyed the main mechanic of this game, that being Link's ability to become a painting and merge onto walls. Link's ability adds a new dimension to the puzzles, and it works perfectly on the 3DS. I really like that the game has the feel of a traditional 2D Zelda game, and when you become a painting, the camera pans to the wall and all of a sudden you're viewing the game from a 3D perspective. Using this new ability to slip through the cracks between Hyrule and Lorule was an absolutely brilliant application of the ability, and it makes complete sense given the context of the story. Speaking of Lorule, that's another brilliant idea. The Zelda team really put their backs into this game and greatly expanded on previously introduced ideas like the Dark World. Since A Link Between Worlds is a spiritual successor to A Link to the Past, the Dark World is ever present in this game, except that the Dark World in this game is called Lorule, an alternate dimension of Hyrule with its very own princess, hero, villain, and even its own Triforce. Well, at least it used to have its own Triforce. See, that's one of the major motivating factors driving the main antagonist of this game. I'll spare the major spoilers, but like in most Zelda games, the bad guy wants the Triforce. In this game though, the reason might surprise you. I personally think that this game has one of the best finales in the Zelda series, so I won't go into any more detail than that. Instead, I'll move on and share one more thing about this game that I really like about it. If you know me, you'll know that I'm a huge fan of Breath of the Wild and the freedom that it gives you to explore, take your own path, and beat the game whichever way you want. Well, A Link Between Worlds might actually be the Zelda team's first experimentation with this concept. In most Zelda games, you have to acquire a specific item before you can access or take on specific dungeons, but in this game, you actually get to take on the dungeons in the way that you see fit. By introducing an item rental system, Link is able to get his hands on various items that are needed to beat different dungeons throughout the map. And by limiting the amount of items that Link can rent at once, it's not like you have everything you could possibly need and the game is in easy mode from the start. The game is still plenty challenging, but now you have the freedom to forge your own path instead of following a linear story from one point to the next. It's ideas like that that eventually got expanded on, paving the path for greater games like Breath of the Wild and eventually Tears of the Kingdom. If you can't tell, I'm a huge fan of A Link Between Worlds. I honestly have a hard time choosing whether I like this game more than Minish Cap for my favorite 2D Zelda game. Even though Minish Cap did win that battle, A Link Between Worlds is still one of my favorite Zelda games, and if you're thinking of playing it, you should. Now that the 3DS eShop is closed too, I'm guessing that the only way you can get your hands on this game is physically, so you'd better hop on that because I think A Link Between Worlds is going to age like fine wine and become increasingly harder to get. Speaking of games that have aged like fine wine though, let's talk about one that hasn't. Having just finished A Link Between Worlds, I was on a Zelda high, and I was chomping at the bit to play another Zelda game. At the time, Rodavia was streaming Zelda 2 The Adventure of Link on our Twitch channel. The Adventure of Link was still on my list of Zelda games that I needed to beat, and I thought it might be fun to try to play the game at the same time as he was. In hindsight though, this was actually the worst possible time I could choose to play The Adventure of Link. What I neglected to consider was that, at the time, I was in the middle of my hardest semester of classes, and my stress level was at an all-time high. I'm a perfectionist, and I was actually failing a class at the time. I'd never been in that position before, and I really felt overwhelmed. Because of the situation I was in, I was hitting the books really hard, and the only time I really had to play video games was late at night before bed. I remember sitting in my bed playing Zelda 2 at like 1 in the morning and just thinking, why am I playing this game? Why am I subjecting myself to this? I would not advise playing Zelda 2 when you're tired. Why? Well, there's so much random cheese in this game that it feels almost like the game is actively trying to make you miserable. Combine that with being exhausted, and you've got yourself a horrible time. I actually covered a specific spot of my bed with pillows so that I could throw my controller at it whenever I got frustrated. This is a video game. There's absolutely no reason I should be doing that, but now you know that was the effect that Zelda 2 had on me. Now, by this point I hope you know, I'm biased when it comes to Zelda games, but Zelda 2, I know for a fact my feelings are mutually agreed on by many Zelda fans. I mean, take this for example. In what world can you explain only being able to beat an enemy by hitting them in the ankle? Watch this clip of me playing Zelda 2 and tell me how it makes sense. I hit this guy in the head multiple times, but for some reason I can only beat him when I hit him ever so slightly in the ankle of all places. I mean, this guy must be a soccer player with how he reacts to getting kicked in the ankle. Okay, jokes aside, what do I not like about Zelda 2? Well, there are a lot of things, but honestly at its core, I think there's really one true reason. Zelda 2 feels completely outdated and irrelevant. Much like the original Zelda game, Zelda 2 came out on the NES. The original Legend of Zelda is a masterpiece that inspired countless other games since it came out, but the same can't be said about its successor. Firstly, Zelda 2 is a completely different type of game. Featuring a very sad excuse for an overworld as well as side-scrolling gameplay, it's nothing like the original. Maybe at its time, the Zelda team was trying to establish originality with the sequels, but I feel like when you're making a sequel game to a series, you have to take what was good about the original game and expand on it with new ideas. And secondly, like I said, there's just too much cheese. My experience with this game was very frustrating. I won't go into any more details about it, but if it hadn't have been for the rewind controls on Nintendo Switch Online, I don't know if I would have made it through Zelda 2. There were so many times something whack would happen and I'd die for the dumbest reason. I really don't like using rewind controls because I think it takes away from a lot of the thrill and suspense, but eventually I reached a point of frustration where I absolutely had to use them. Now, I could criticize Zelda 2 all day, but honestly that's not what this video is about. I don't want to get overly negative and angry with this game again, so instead, I'll finish this part of the video on a positive note. Zelda 2 actually has a really cool and fascinating story. If you like the lore in the Zelda series, you'll like this game. Since it was a NES game and one of the original games of the series, you have to fish for the story a little more, but it really is enjoyable. In fact, after I played Zelda 2, I liked a specific part of the story so much that I made a video about it and put it on our channel. The video goes into the history of the royal family and why Zelda might not have any siblings. I thought it was interesting, and if you're interested too, you can find it on the channel. Zelda 2 really is the redheaded stepchild of the Zelda series. It's not one that many people would rank highly in their tier list, and honestly I agree. The game really has aged poorly, and it's a real drag to try to pick up and play it. I definitely didn't have a good experience with it, and when I think about giving it a second chance, I just get flashbacks on how bad it was and how much I didn't enjoy it. It's one that you really do have to play if you really want to beat all the games in the canonical timeline, so if you're trying to do that like I did, good luck. Pay attention more to the story and less to the wonky and poorly aged gameplay. And with that, I survived my least favorite Zelda game. In addition, I managed to survive my worst semester of school. It was now the summer right before my last year of school, and I only had 4 Zelda games left to beat. Things were getting real. Of the 4 left that I had to beat, only 2 of them were the traditional single-player Zelda games, those being Oracle of Ages and Phantom Hourglass. I ended up choosing to play Phantom Hourglass because I figured it'd be a better change of pace from Zelda 2. If you've made it this far in the video, you might have already forgotten, but Spirit Tracks was actually the first Zelda game I ever played, and it's sort of the sequel to Phantom Hourglass. In addition, Phantom Hourglass is actually the direct sequel to Windwaker. I had no idea. In Phantom Hourglass, we get to follow Link, Tetra, and her pirate crew after they defeat Ganondorf in the Windwaker and sail away in search of new adventures. In Phantom Hourglass, they find those adventures after a chance encounter with the ghost ship sends Link and Tetra to the world of the Ocean King, another vast ocean like the Great Sea in the Windwaker. If you like the Windwaker, I think you're going to like Phantom Hourglass. I know I did, since Phantom Hourglass has the same fun and goofy tone, as well as a cartoon-like art style. Where Phantom Hourglass differs from the Windwaker though, is how it's played. Wind Waker came out on the GameCube, and it was controlled like most console Zelda games. Phantom Hourglass, on the other hand, came out on the Nintendo DS, and is controlled like no other Zelda game had been up to that point. See, Phantom Hourglass uses touch controls to move Link, attack, and control most of the game. I know some people don't like these controls, but really, I didn't mind them. I was used to the touchscreen because I played Spirit Tracks such a long time ago, and it was really my introduction to the whole Zelda series. For someone new to this style of gameplay, I could definitely see it taking some time getting used to, but honestly I think it works really well. Sailing across the ocean is also different from the Wind Waker, but again, it still has the same charm. In my opinion, I think the Zelda team really handled the transition to the Nintendo DS really well, despite the obvious changes in gameplay. And as a side note, the graphics are also much less refined, but that makes sense considering that Phantom Hourglass is on the tiny 2-screened Nintendo DS. In my opinion, where Phantom Hourglass really shines though, is in its characters. When I said it has the same charm as the Wind Waker, I meant it. Wind Waker did a great job with characterization, and Phantom Hourglass is no different. It introduces some fun, memorable characters, all of whom feel uniquely individual. The one character who shines the brightest in Phantom Hourglass though is Linebeck, the greedy, selfish, and cowardly captain of the ship that Link sails on for the majority of the game. Linebeck is such an iconic character, not only in Phantom Hourglass, but also the Zelda series as a whole. His growth and development over the course of the game is really great and honestly unforgettable. He has a similar celebrity status within the Zelda series as Groose from Skyward Sword does, and he adds so much value to the overall story. Phantom Hourglass really is a charming little Zelda game. Since it came out on Nintendo DS, it really slides under the radar compared to most Zelda games. Right now, the only ways that you can play it are if you have the original cartridge for Nintendo DS, or if you download it from the Wii U eShop. So if you're wanting to play this game, you'd better get it quick, because the moment it isn't available to get on the Wii U eShop, the physical game's value is probably going to go up astronomically. Honestly, the same goes for Spirit Tracks too. The Nintendo DS Zelda games truly are hidden gems within the series, and I highly recommend giving them a go. Even though they're a bit goofy and have unconventional controls, they have so much charm that's accompanied by fun stories and amazing soundtracks. And just like that, I was now down to 3 Zelda games. 2 of them were multiplayer and 1 was single player. Earlier in this video, I mentioned that 4 Swords motivated me and my buddies from the Torque Force to do an even more ambitious stream. And I also mentioned that the Minish Cap left a legacy in the form of a trilogy between the Minish Cap, 4 Swords, and 4 Sword Adventures. Well, the alluded to ambitious stream that my buddies and I thought of was for The Legend of Zelda 4 Sword Adventures, the finale of the 4 Sword trilogy. So what made this stream so ambitious, you might ask? Well, 4 Sword Adventures isn't like any other multiplayer game you've seen before. You might call it a cross-functional or cross-platform multiplayer game because it's played not only on the GameCube, but also on the Game Boy Advance. What's crazy about this though is that you use both systems at the same time. You go from playing on the GameCube to playing on your Game Boy Advance. How, you might ask? Well, the Game Boy Advance actually had a cable that allowed it to connect to the GameCube to be used as a GameCube controller. When using this function with Four Sword Adventures, the game actually lets you not only use the Game Boy Advance controller, but also the screen. Rather than change the TV screen when you go inside caves or houses, Four Sword Adventures actually takes advantage of the Game Boy Advance's screen and uses that whenever you go inside anywhere. Why is this so cool though? Remember, like I said, this is a multiplayer game. By giving every player a whole extra screen to look at, it gives everyone a lot more freedom to explore and play independently. It's almost like, rather than splitting the TV screen into 4 different smaller screens, Nintendo just gave everyone a whole new screen in the form of the Game Boy. Since this is a 4-player game, it actually takes 5 screens total, 1 main TV screen and 4 Game Boy Advance screens. What's even crazier though is that you can use the Game Boy Player as a Game Boy Advance, and if you have all the tools, you can play Four Sword Adventures on 5 TV screens. Instead of looking up and down between a TV and a Game Boy Advance, you can upgrade your setup and make the most ultimate multiplayer Zelda experience possible. And so, that's what my buddies and I set out to do. We wanted to have the most ultimate multiplayer Zelda experience, and we even took it to the nth degree. We decided that we were going to capture and stream all 5 screens so we could share our experience with everyone. We wanted everyone to be able to see what it's actually like playing Four Sword Adventures just how it's intended, because nowadays it's so difficult to do that. It's a lot harder to just casually get together with your 4 friends who just happen to have 4 Game Boy Advances and spend 15 hours beating the game. We wanted to share our experience with everyone who isn't able to do that, so even if they couldn't play the game, they could at least experience it. Now, if you followed the Torque Force for a while, you'll know that we aren't always known to have the most professional or quality streams, but for our Four Sword Adventure stream, we really went all out. Here's a list of all the equipment that went into making this stream happen. First, we needed a copy of Four Sword Adventures, and after that, we needed 5 GameCubes. 1 for the actual game, and 4 with Game Boy players to function as our Game Boy Advances. Then we needed 5 TVs, 1 for the actual game, and 4 to function as our Game Boy Advances screens. We also needed 4 GameCube controllers, 1 plugged into each of the Game Boy Player GameCubes. Because we were using Game Boy players, we also needed a disc to start up the Game Boy player. There are a few different ways that you can do this, and we went with the way that allowed us to capture the best looking footage of the game. Also, since we were streaming the game and wanted to capture the best looking footage, we also had 5 GameCube HDMI adapters. We used a mix of Eon GC HD Mach 2s and Retrobit Prism HDMI adapters. Both of these are great options if you want to get your GameCube to HDMI quality. In addition to all of this, we also used 5 different capture cards to capture the main game as well as all 4 Game Boy screens. We also had a computer to run the stream and a microphone to capture the audio. We streamed Four Sword Adventures over the course of 2 different streams. Here are pictures of what both of our stream setups looked like. Crazy, right? There's so much going on in both of these pictures. The first time we streamed the game, we actually spent like 3 hours setting up the night before. There were so many different moving pieces within this setup, and honestly, if you were to just play the game instead of streaming it, it wouldn't be nearly as intensive. Since we wanted to share our experience with the world though, we spent the time to make it happen. I'm so glad we did too. I honestly won't ever forget playing this game with my friends. The first stream we did was back in summer of 2021. We spent an entire Friday evening in Arcarius' basement streaming the first half of the game. Because of various life events, we weren't able to stream Four Sword Adventures again until December of 2022. Over a year and a half had gone by, but thankfully we were all able to get together and stream the second half of the game. This time in my wife's and my apartment. That's right, I said the W word. My girlfriend, who had become my fiance, was now my wife. We're now in a whole new stage of life, but my Zelda addiction is definitely still a thing. Thankfully though, my wife still loves me regardless of that. Back to Four Sword Adventures though, we were able to play the game over 2 different streams, and it took somewhere around 15 hours total to do that. I won't go into too much detail with the game since I've already talked a lot about everything that went into playing it, but what I will tell you is that the game is super fun, especially when you play it with close friends like I did. It brings out the best and the worst of you, but only in the best ways. There's a single player version of the game, but if you're able to, you have to play the multiplayer. There's so many fun puzzles and challenges that my friends and I got to figure out and compete in. And honestly, I know that that part of the experience would have been missing if I had only played the single player version. Like I mentioned though, not everyone's able to play the multiplayer version of this game because of all the moving pieces and logistics that go into making it happen. If you're wanting to see what the multiplayer version of the game is like though, you can watch our entire playthrough on our YouTube channel. We have a whole playlist with our entire stream separated into smaller videos. It's really fun to go back and watch all of my buddies and my shenanigans as we all try to beat the game while simultaneously sabotaging each other. Definitely check it out if you're interested. Four Sword Adventures is secretly a really special game in the Legend of Zelda series. I think it might be the best example of the Zelda team's willingness to go outside of the box and really try to innovate and get the most out of whatever console their game comes out on. Unfortunately, in Four Sword Adventure's case, it ended up being a flop and it's actually the least sold Zelda game of all time. The only reason that happened though was because of how hard it is to play the game like it's actually supposed to be played. The logistics behind making it happen and the availability of the GameCube and Game Boy Advance hardware nowadays makes it near impossible to just pick up and play with your friends any given day. That said, if you're like me and my friends, if you really put in the time and are intentional with making this game, this experience happen, then you'll never forget it. I don't know what the future has in store for the Torque Force, but honestly I think our Four Sword Adventure streams were among the coolest things we'll ever do on this channel. So with Four Sword Adventures finished, I had now beaten the Four Sword / Minish Cap trilogy, and I was now down to 2 games left on my list of Zelda games to beat. The 2 games I had left to play were Oracle of Ages and Triforce Heroes. I know what you're thinking, I saved the best for last. In all honesty though, these 2 games were definitely not the ideal last 2 to play, and they both definitely took the longest to beat from a patience standpoint. I started with Oracle of Ages first, so I'll go ahead and get into that one. If I could describe Oracle of Ages in one word, it would have to be tedious. I really don't want to spend a ton of time talking about Oracle of Ages because I've already covered a lot of my gripes when I talked about Oracle of Seasons. That said, I really had an especially hard time beating Oracle of Ages. See, I think Oracle of Ages went above and beyond with the puzzle aspect of the game, but unfortunately a lot of the puzzles felt irrelevant and unnecessary. When I played the game, it really felt like I was just going from puzzle to puzzle, and that each puzzle got progressively less important from a story perspective. Normally Zelda games have puzzles that end up rewarding the player with story progression, new items, or some other unique feature within the game. But Oracle of Ages really felt like it was just filled with puzzles for the sake of having them. What really made up for this though was that I played the linked version of Oracle of Ages. See, what's cool about the Oracle games is that they're linked, and after beating one game you can input a special code to unlock a secret ending in the other game. For someone who likes the story aspect of the Zelda series, I had to play the linked version. In the linked version of the game, you actually get a chance to fight Twin Rova, the Gerudo sisters who are trying to revive Ganondorf, and after beating them, you actually get to fight Ganon in order to rescue Zelda. This secret ending does a really good job at tying both of the Oracle games together and making them feel like one intertwined story. While Oracle of Ages and Oracle of Seasons can both function independently, they lose part of their charm if they aren't linked together. Neither of the Oracle games were really my favorites, but overall I think there's still a couple of fun games within the Zelda series, and I think they're another cool example of how the Zelda team has always been willing to try something new. And with that very brief review of Oracle of Ages, I was now down to my very last Zelda game that I had to beat, and I planned on beating it in the most fashionable way possible. This infamous last game that I had to beat was The Legend of Zelda Triforce Heroes, a game about Link styling all over his opponents with his superior sense of fashion. You think I'm joking, but I'm actually not. I'm gonna go ahead and put this out there, The Legend of Zelda Triforce Heroes was a failure of a Zelda game, but it only failed because of how ridiculous the story was. I'll spare you the gory details, but essentially Link wanders into the kingdom of Hytopia and is tasked with rescuing Styla because her drip was stolen by the evil Lady Maud. It's absolutely ridiculous, and I honestly have no idea what the Zelda team was thinking when they came up with this story. That said, outside of the story, I really enjoyed Triforce Heroes. To start out, Triforce Heroes is another multiplayer Zelda game, but this time it's on the 3DS, and you don't need to go through nearly as much effort to play it with your friends as you did for other multiplayer entries in the series. Really, all you need is 3 friends, their 3DSs, and a copy of the game. It's not nearly as hard, and in fact, my buddies Arcarius and Goodlovem actually streamed the game with me on our channel. We've got our entire playthrough on our YouTube channel as well, so if you're interested, you can check that out. Since we're playing on our 3DSs though, I'll go ahead and warn you, the quality is whack. I literally filmed my 3DS with my phone's camera. Here's a picture of what this stream looked like from my perspective in case you really don't believe how whack it actually was. Back to the things I like about Triforce Heroes though. Like the name implies, it's 3-player multiplayer and formatted as a series of different levels like the other multiplayer games in the series. You start out at level 1, which is very basic, and eventually you work your way up to the final boss, Lady Mud. As each level progresses, the enemies and puzzles also progressively get harder, and you're able to utilize various items throughout the entire game to beat these enemies and solve all the puzzles. In addition to items, Link can also change into a series of costumes, all of which offer some sort of upgrade in power in some form or fashion as you complete each level. I really like the costume feature because customability is definitely something that older Zelda games failed to deliver on. It's one of the reasons I like Breath of the Wild so much, and it's something that makes any game instantaneously more fun. All the puzzles in Triforce Heroes are also a lot more complicated than they were in the other multiplayer games in the series. Because the 3DS is more powerful than the Game Boy Advance or the GameCube, the Zelda team was able to add a lot more depth to the puzzles, and I found that my buddies and I really had to work hard and collaborate with each other in order to solve some of them. Features like Totem Time create so much more opportunity, and little additions like the emotes on the touchscreen really make communication fun in this game. Surprisingly, I had a lot of fun playing Triforce Heroes. Sure, the story was absolutely awful, and sure, my friends and I were glad to be done with it by the time we were finished, but honestly, I think there's a lot of potential for this game. I just don't think you'll ever see this game living up to that potential because of its fever dream of a story. And with that, I had finally finished beating all the Zelda games in the series. After 5 years, I had finally played through them all. From Zelda 1 all the way to Breath of the Wild, I beat every game in the canonical timeline, just in time for Tears of the Kingdom. I'm super glad that I did too, because I feel like with each game I played, I gained an even greater appreciation for the Legend of Zelda series, and I think I really started to understand what makes the Zelda series so special among other video game series. Even outside of the fact that Zelda has just been outright iconic for the last 35 plus years, the series is so great because the Zelda team is always looking to innovate and always looking to get the most out of whatever console their games come out on. Whether swinging a sword with the Wii Remote, controlling Link with a touchscreen and stylus, using gyroscopic controls to solve puzzles, or even connecting Game Boy Advances to GameCubes to introduce a whole new type of multiplayer gameplay, the Zelda team is always looking to innovate and try new things. Sure, sometimes those new features might be seen as gimmicks, but honestly, I think that's what makes it special. In those 5 years that it took me to beat all the Zelda games, I also managed to go through a lot of life changes. I moved across the country multiple times, worked several unique jobs, graduated college, and got engaged and married to the love of my life. In between all of that too, I was able to spend a ton of time with old friends, which not only strengthened our friendships with each other, but also led to new friendships. Over the last 5 years, I've been so blessed to be surrounded by such great friends. The Zelda series didn't necessarily bring us all together. We still would have been friends regardless, but what it did do was act as a catalyst and help us create unforgettable memories with each other. Without the Zelda series, the Torque Force wouldn't have existed, and all the memories that my friends and I have with this channel would be gone. So, if you haven't figured out by this point, I love the Legend of Zelda series. From the moment that Brodavia lent me Breath of the Wild, I was hooked on it. Whether directly or indirectly, the series has fostered friendships, relieved stress, and encouraged my creativity and problem solving. It's weird to think that I've been a fan of the series for over 5 years now. So much has happened to me in that time, and honestly, I don't think I'd take any of it back. I'm thankful for the impact the series has had on my life, and I'm excited to see what the future has in store for it and me. And with that, you finally made it to the end of the video. If you're like me and you think the Legend of Zelda series has had an impact on your life, let me know in the comments section. Tell me what you think about all the games I've mentioned in this video, and let me know whether you agree or disagree with my opinions. If you're new to our channel and you enjoyed the video, we'd really appreciate it if you liked it and subscribed to our channel. You can also check out our Twitch channel that's linked in the description below. We'll definitely be doing a lot of fun streams in the future, especially when Tears of the Kingdom comes out. And with that, you've listened to me ramble about the Legend of Zelda series for almost 2 hours now. Thank you so much for your support, and without further ado, goodbye.
Hear me scream, I'm here to break your streamer. Hear me scream, I'm here to break your streamer.